If you're a visitor, if you're just coming back, we've been on a journey together of a sermon series based on a book I wrote that was launched back in 2012. The book's called Six Radical Decisions, and if you'd like a copy, we've still got half a dozen copies left. You can see maybe Heather or I, and we'll sort a copy out for you. The thesis of the book is really simple. It is that whenever the church is at its best, there have been six things that are common. The first is, and really the main thing, is that Jesus is Lord. The second thing is that as a result, as people orientate themselves around Jesus, they learn to accept the mission that he has for them. And as they do that, they start to realize, as you step out in the way that Jesus is asking you to step out, you start to realize you just can't do it on your own. You need friends. We need fellowship. And as I said a few weeks ago when we were talking about this, a fellow by the name of Howard Snyder says the church is facing a fellowship crisis. Too many of us are trying to do life on our own. And as a church family here at Citywide Baptist, we really want to work out what does it mean to step into real fellowship and community. That is a driving question for us. And then we said that whenever the church has been at its best, it's been hospitable. It's been creating space for others. Now, last week on Father's Day, I was going to preach this message. But as we said, so we had an object lesson so we need to fix up some of the technical stuff, and it didn't quite work, but the sense that Jesus knew what he was doing, and at both congregations we had a pretty special time. But the fifth radical decision, whenever the church has been at its best, what happens is as people live from the first four radical decisions, they create an environment where the people around them are empowered. There's been a bit of a disease in the Protestant church since the time of the Reformation where we pushed against like church control and that kind of thing and emphasised the role of the individual. And we had to have that conversation, but kind of the disease became my God, my Bible, my way, and it became about pulling myself up by my bootstraps and personal success. And we really emphasised individuality. Now, it's not that was a wrong thing to be emphasising. I think we've got things a little out of balance. And whenever the church has been at its best, it hasn't been full of people who are focusing on themselves. It's been full of people who are creating space for each other. So I want to talk about what empowerment actually is. What does it mean to be empowering others? A biblical understanding of empowerment is the freedom to step into the unique story that God has for you. It is just so important to understand that God has a unique story for you. There will never be another you. And there is a calling that's on your life. And your task as you follow Jesus is to step into that calling and not to copy anybody else. There has never been a book written on how to be you. Your task is genuinely to be you. Disempowerment, a biblical understanding of disempowerment, is living a life that is less than you were created for. Playing your life according to somebody else's tune. That is what disempowerment actually means. Up front, I want to say the most important question you'll ever ask is, what is the story by which you live your life? There are all kinds of forces telling you who you are and what you need in order to be successful. There is only one source of a story that will help you actually move towards freedom. one of the, last week, it was interesting with the timing and how it all worked, but last week I spent some time with the Alina Valley crew unpacking the place of the Bible. And this question of what truth is in this moment is fundamentally important. As I said in that sermon, there's now a whole industry set up around fact checking, because we no longer trust that our leaders will be telling us the truth. I also shared the personal journey, the journey of discipleship for me, where I have over time and time again, I have had to realign my own story with the truth. I shared with you lies I believed about my wife and how I needed a mate to come along and say, your marriage is in trouble and it's all your wife's fault, you know. And that I needed this reality realignment. You've got to understand that it's the stories you believe to be true that will be the ultimate source of your empowerment or disempowerment. It's the stories you believe to be true that will be the ultimate source of your empowerment or disempowerment. And I just love that Jesus says, the truth will set you free. As Christians, the last thing we need to be scared of is truth. In John 8:31, it's in this context that Jesus says it. He says to the Jews there, he says, if you hold to my teaching, you are really my disciples. Then you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. That, what he's saying, and we need to hear this because we've grown up in a version of church that tends to emphasise head knowledge. And what he says is, fundamentally, the question is whether you're going to live your life according to Jesus' story or not. You can know intellectually all the theology you want to know, but the fundamental question is, are you going to live your life according to Jesus' story or not? And I think if you are able to be honest with yourself, every time you have made choices other than the story that Jesus has for you, it hasn't let you be more free. Can you be honest about that? The task of a true disciple of Jesus is to step into the story he has for us. I actually think Dallas Willard was right when he said, our task is not to try and silence all the opposition to, the way we believe, but to put Jesus into a worldwide competition with all known alternatives. It's the only way we can give our chance to prove his power over the whole of life. We don't have to be scared to say, look, what does it mean to actually trust all of who Jesus is and live our life according to that? And that is the path to true freedom and to true empowerment. And so I'm just going to spend the rest of our time before we come to communion in the book of Galatians. So if you've got your Bibles, I encourage you to pull it out. You'll find, I actually encourage you this coming week to read through the whole book. So I'm only going to be able to touch on the themes of the book. But the book of Galatians is written to people who had allowed themselves to become disempowered. The book of Galatians is kind of Paul's most angry book. You can see his frustration as he writes this, you idiots, what are you doing? You knew the truth. And you've let someone, literally in the message it says, you let someone cut in on you to drive you off the road. You're heading towards freedom and you've allowed yourself to become slaves, is kind of the theme of the whole book. I love one of my favourite verses, and we need to hear this. Because sometimes we can fall into the trap of thinking that our faith somehow is a bondage. You know, that's one of Satan's lies. Listen to this. It is for freedom that Christ has set us free. Stand firm then. And do not let yourselves be burdened again by a yoke of slavery. You need to hear that this morning. You are called to freedom. You are called to be wholly you. That is Jesus' heart for you. In Galatians, Paul actually talks about two kinds of slavery. And so in order to understand what it means to empower others, we need to understand what disempowerment looks like. And Paul talks about, in my view, the two main forms of disempowerment. The first is slavery to religion. Now, we can read it and think, well, that doesn't apply to us, we're not Jews. But we need to step back and say, okay, what actually is religion? Every religion has laws that tell you what you need to be in order to be okay. Every religion has laws that tell you what you need to be in order to be okay. And the Jews that Paul is writing to had let themselves fall back into an external kind of religion that says, I've got to act in this way. And it was all about the external. Now, we got to face that sometimes we as Christians can fall into this religious kind of trap, where we start living an external kind of faith. And it's all about being a good boy or a good girl. Jesus was toughest on people who just focused on the external. And he says, no, it's about your heart, boys and girls. It's about what's actually going on, not what you pretend is going on. Now, I love that Jesus says the truth will set you free. And I know that is the journey of discipleship, is the journey towards freedom. But it's not only religious Christianity we've got to watch out for. There are all kinds of other religions. And I'm not just talking about Hinduism or Buddhism or Islam here. I'm talking about all kinds of other systems that create laws that tell you what you need to be in order to be okay. If you don't mind, in Galatians, this is how Paul defines what religion is. The law is not based on faith. On the contrary, it says, the person who does these things will live by them. That in religion, if you do this, this is how you find life. And one of the things we have to face is we tend to be very judgmental about each other's actions. We tend to judge each other based on our what we read of their behaviour, but we judge ourselves based on what we understand of our motivation. So we are set up to be prejudiced because we tend to live life selfishly. Well, if you don't mind, I'm going to quote from a guy who probably was quite likely was not a Christian. If you study literature, you'll probably come across. He wrote they say one of the great books of the 20th century. They call it that. I don't know that I would say it that way, but it was apparently a very good bit of writing. His name was David Foster Wallace. Anyone read any of David Foster Wallace's books? No? Okay, good. So you won't know what I'm saying, that's fine. I actually think he had a pretty good point. Listen to what he said. And in the day-to-day trenches of adult life, there is no such thing as atheism. There is no such thing as not worshipping. Everybody worships. The only choice we get is what to worship. And an outstanding reason for choosing some sort of God or spiritual type thing to worship is that pretty much anything else you worship will eat you alive. If you worship, if you make your religion money and things, if they are where you find meaning in life, as Paul said, if that is where you believe that is your path to life, money and stuff, then you will never have enough. Never feel you have enough. It's the truth. Worship your own body, beauty, and sexual allure, and you will always feel ugly. And when time and age start showing, you will die a million deaths before they finally plant you. Worship power, and you'll feel weak and afraid, and you'll need ever more power over others to keep the fear at bay. Worship your intellect, being seen as smart, you'll end up feeling stupid, a fraud, always on the verge of being found out. The insidious thing about these forms of worship is not that they're evil or sinful, it's that they're unconscious. They're the default settings. They're the kind of worship you just gradually slip into day after day, getting more and more selective about what you see, really believing that if you have enough of this, I'm finally going to find life. You see, I don't think that the real question is how do we convince atheists that God is real? No, the real question is how do we help every person discover that the only person worthy of worship is Jesus Christ. And He is the only path to life. And we want to encourage every person who is trying to live their life finding life somewhere else to be honest with themselves. Like, you reflect on your own life. When you have tried to find life in money or your body or your intellect, is that true? You know that stuff doesn't lead to life. We know that. We need not to be scared, as Dallas Willard said, of holding Jesus up to the alternatives, because the alternatives do not produce life. So we need to face, if we're to be honest, we need to face our own idolatry. Because there are times, even if you say you're a follower of Jesus, there are times where you are looking for love in all the wrong places, where you are looking for meaning in all the wrong places. The antidote to religion is the grace that only comes through the truth of living Jesus' story. I've already mentioned, I think, that one of my favourite books is What's So Amazing About Grace. It's by a guy called Philip Yancey. What I found most helpful was the back cover. So if you can't afford the book, just read the back cover. There's a line on there, and it's important you hear this. There's nothing you can do to make God love you anymore, and there's nothing you can possibly have done to make God love you any less. We need to get past the idea that life comes from what we do. That's what karma is about. Karma is be a good boy and move ahead. Grace says, no, I am loved. Paul put it this way, he says, through the law, I died to the law so that I might live for God. I've been crucified with Christ. And I no longer live, but Christ lives in me. As we come to baptism in a couple of weeks' time, what actually is being shown through the act of baptism is an identification that Paul's talking about here with who Jesus is and the grace that only came through him. As you go down in the water, what you're actually doing is identifying with Jesus' death. And when you come up out of the water, what you're actually saying is, I no longer live for me. I live for him. And I know he is the path to life. That is why baptism is such a special and important part, and often the very first step in the adventure with Jesus. Because it's kind of a public acknowledgement with your church family, I'm in. I'm on this road, and I'm going to live my life by grace, not by religion, is what baptism's about. Paul says, the life I now live in the body, I live by faith in the Son of God who loved me and gave himself for me. Listen to this, I do not set aside the grace of God. Because if righteousness could be gained by being a good boy or girl, Jesus didn't need to come. I love the hope that is only available through grace. You see, I know how often I stuff up. I know, like the Apostle Paul, there's part of me that's pretty messy. There's part of me that's self-focused. But I also know Jesus looks me in the eyes and says, Matt, I love you. And you need to hear that. There is nothing you can possibly have done. Bring to mind the worst things you've done. There's nothing you can possibly have done to stop God loving you. And no matter how many brownie points you try and win from him by being a good boy or good girl, that will not make him love you anymore. This is what grace is about. It actually is counterintuitive. We are wired to think that karma wins. But grace is a whole different way of living. And as we come at the end of the sermon, we'll introduce communion. Jesus knew that we continually will keep slipping back into karma. We'll continually keep slipping back into religion, where we think we've got to be a good boy or good girl to earn his love. And the reason he gave us this object lesson of communion is he knew we'd need to be reminded. This is my blood given for you. This is my body broken for you. Do this in remembrance of me. Keep remembering what grace looks like. That's the first kind of slavery. And I don't know, can you identify the religions you get sucked into? It may be religious Christianity, it may be money, it may be stuff, I don't know. But can you identify for you? It's important you do. Otherwise, you'll live your life on a treadmill, continually looking for life in all the wrong places. The second kind of slavery that Paul talks about, he spends the first 3/4 of the book dealing with religion, and then he gets on to a different kind of slavery. You see, when you no longer know the external rules, you can be left with the story of your flesh. Paul says in Galatians 5:17, the flesh desires what is contrary to the spirit, and the spirit what is contrary to the flesh. They're in conflict with each other, so that you listen to this. This is one of the most countercultural things you can say at the moment. You are not to do whatever you want. But if you're led by the Spirit, you're not under the law. There is a part of you, if you're honest, there is part of you that would prefer not to do what God wants for your life. If you can be honest about that. The flesh, as the Bible talks about the flesh is the part of me that wants to minimize pain and maximize pleasure. Can you identify that in you? There is part of you, if you're to be honest, that wants to get as close to anything that feels good and as far away from anything that hurts as possible. And you'll spend good money in order to do that. The people we pay the most in our society are the people who help us avoid pain and maximise pleasure, both legally and illegally. Have you noticed that? Can you spot that in yourself? I know for me that there's a messy part of me that is often driven by, the need to avoid pain and maximise pleasure. And I'd be worrying about confessing that to you, except I know something about you. Isn't that true? We got to be honest with each other, folks. It is not fair to expect each other to be stainless steel spiritual computers. We have to have the guts, like the Apostle Paul, to say the things I want to do, I don't do. The things I don't want to do, that's the stuff I keep on doing. So if the antidote to the first kind of slavery is grace, what is the antidote to our flesh? Well, Paul says, you, my brothers and sisters, were called to be free. But do not use your freedom to indulge the flesh. He's saying, don't live your life based on rules, but also don't live your life based on that part of you that wants to minimise pain and maximise pleasure. Rather, serve one another humbly in love. For the entire law is fulfilled in keeping this one command: love your neighbour as yourself. I know something. If you don't have people in your life that are more valuable to you than your own ego, then your flesh is running the show. If you don't have people in your life to love more than you love yourself, that your decision-making apparatus is minimising pain and maximising pleasure. And you will be very predictable. Whenever pain comes, you'll try and get away from it, however that works for you. We've all got our own strategies for that. And whenever pleasure rears its head, you'll try and head in that direction. Paul says, no. He said, this is why we need each other. You see this most clearly with young mums and dads, where in the middle of the night, suffering from extreme sleep deprivation, and everything in their body is saying, please, please be quiet. The baby cries. And there's sometimes a conversation about who's going, but there is never really a question about somebody's going. But the job of a parent is to put their needs aside for their child. The job of the church is to be full of people who love each other enough to put their needs aside for each other. Philippians 2, Paul in this slightly happier letter to the Philippians says, do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit. Rather, in humility, value others above yourselves. Not looking to your own interests, but each of you to the interests of others. I know when Jesus says the truth will set you free, what he's saying is, if you step into the truth of my grace and the truth of a life lived for love, you'll actually become a freer and freer person. But if you want to live a life based on religion and minimising pain and maximising pleasure, have you bumped into people like that? You'll notice they're not big people. They're small, predictable people. And want to be like that, do we? As we find our place in the truth of God's story, we find ourselves living in a way that builds platforms for others. I was deeply moved going to a place called Robben Island, just off Cape Town, where Nelson Mandela was imprisoned. He was fighting for freedom for black people in South Africa, and he spent 30 years in this prison. And when eventually the tide turned and he became president of South Africa, he said something that I think he was obviously very influenced by what he read in the Bible, but had this problem because a lot of the apartheid stuff happened by Christians who were twisting the Bible and using the Bible to promote racism, frankly. But he said this, and I think we need to be challenged by his words. For to be free is not merely to cast off one's chains, but to live in a way that respects and enhances the freedom of others. We can't afford to be my God, my Bible, my way. We've got to live in such a way that encourages everybody to step into true freedom. This is what it means to be a follower of Jesus. I'm really proud of my dad, actually. It's nice the day after, this is the week after Father's Day, but to say he, as a young man, he grew up as a street kid in Sydney and discovered Jesus at the age of 15 and just wanted to tell people about Jesus. And literally thousands of people came to faith through his ministry. He had a huge impact all over the country and, in fact, all over the world. What he would say often is, it's not what you do with your life, but what you set in motion that counts. I saw him live that out. And still, interesting enough, trying to live it out now. This is a photo that I took in Ghana. It's here. You can probably pick which one's he. He's not wearing the dress. And these are Muslim elders who have turned up in the village to say thanks for the work he established in Ghana. It was an interesting moment. They actually handed him a chicken. He wasn't quite sure what to do with it. It was alive. And one of the things I learnt from him as he did his best and to hang on and to Jesus, and as I watched him, what motivated him was his love for Jesus right the way through his whole life. Still does. And at best, his life created platforms for thousands of people around the world who are still stepping into ministry in new ways. The fifth radical decision is stepping out of religion and stepping out of your flesh and living a life that empowers others. Living a life of freedom that sets other people free. We're going to, in a minute, we're going to sing, and we're going to participate in communion at both sites, and the communion elements will come around while we are singing. But as I said before, there is something important about this little meal. It's something that Jesus instituted. He said, "Do this in remembrance of me." He said, "Take this chunk of bread," and he broke it. And he said, "This is my body, broken for you. Take it and eat it." Then he took a goblet of wine, This is currently empty, but we'll get you some, and it won't be wine that we get you. We'll get you some cordial. But there was no particular power in the bread. There was no particular power in the wine, but in what they represented. He said, "Take this, drink in remembrance of me. This is my blood shed for you." In both those things, he's not saying, if you're a good boy or girl. No, he's saying, I know you. I love you. And you're going to need to remember that. And it was a meal done together. It wasn't, you can, if you like, grab a bit of bread and a bit of wine and have communion yourself. But the point of it is it's a communal activity. We do it together. And we step into the freedom that Christ sets us together. Faith was never meant to be a solo journey. So I'm going to invite the band up. I'm just going to pray. And as we sing, I want you to hear these words as we sing these words together. As we sing about the moment that brought and purchased freedom. I might just pray, and then we'll sing, and then I'm going to come back. So at both sites, while we're singing, both at Lena Valley and here, you'll receive a little cup and a little cracker, and I invite you to hold on to those, and after the song I'll come back and we'll close off together. So Jesus, as we come, we just want to say thank you. And for each one of us, we acknowledge we're not as free as we want to be. We haven't fully yet at this side of eternity stepped into your freedom, and we know that your heart for us is that we would be free. So as we come to your communion table, as we come again to the foot of Calvary, can you please help us enter fully into your grace? And in response to your love, learn how to actually love. In your name, Jesus. Amen.
If you'd like to stand, please feel free, but if you'd like to stay seated, that's completely fine as well.
Calvary's Hill, a revolution began. Grace entered time and space. And the past no longer had to define the future. No matter what you've done, no matter what the past has been, Jesus loves you. And so he invited us on a regular basis to remember, because he knew we forget. He knew we get lost. He knew we get stuck in religion and stuck in the flesh. And so he said, take, eat in remembrance of my body broken for you. Let's eat together. And on that same night, he took this little goblet of wine and he said, you need to understand, this is how much I love you. This is my blood that takes care of all the mess, that invites you to live a life of love because I love you. Let's drink together. Jesus, we just want to say thank you. We acknowledge how easily we get trapped in religion, how easily we get trapped in our flesh, and how quickly we lose sight of other people. Thank you that you came to point a different way, to invite us to whole life. Jesus, help us be people that empower others because you empowered us. You created the ultimate platform for us in the shape of a cross. Help us not get away with being self-centered. We know that path leads to death. We don't want that. Jesus, help us step into your life. In your name. Amen.